The old convent stood quietly at the edge of a small town, surrounded by tall trees that whispered softly whenever the wind passed through them. Life there followed a steady rhythm. The bells rang at the same time each day, meals were simple and shared in silence, and every sister had her duties. It was a peaceful place, far from the noise of the outside world. Among the sisters was one who had been there longer than most. She was known as Sister Margaret. Her hair had turned completely white years ago, and her hands carried the gentle marks of time. Yet her eyes still held a soft brightness, the kind that made people feel calm just by being near her. Sister Margaret lived a quiet life, even by convent standards. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when she did, her voice was warm but brief. Most of her days were spent in the garden, tending to flowers and herbs. She had a special way with plants. Even the weakest ones seemed to grow stronger under her care. To the younger sisters, she was a symbol of patience and kindness. If someone felt overwhelmed or unsure, they would often find her sitting on a wooden bench in the garden. She never gave long advice, but somehow her simple words always helped. But there was something about Sister Margaret that very few people knew. Long before she came to the convent, before the quiet life and simple routines, she had once lived in a world filled with music. As a young woman, she had spent hours every day at a piano. It wasn't just a hobby for her, it was something much deeper. Music had been her way of expressing feelings she couldn't put into words. She had trained for years, learning complex pieces and performing in small gatherings. People who heard her play often said there was something special in the way she touched the keys. It wasn't just skill, it was emotion. Every note seemed to carry a story. But life does not always follow the paths we expect. At some point, something changed. No one at the convent knew the full story. Sister Margaret never spoke about it. All they knew was that she had chosen a different life. She left behind the world of music and stepped into a life of service and silence. Over time, her past became something like a forgotten chapter. Even she rarely allowed herself to think about it. The convent did have an old piano. It stood in a corner of a small common room, covered with a thin layer of dust. It had been there for many years, but no one really used it anymore. Some of the younger sisters didn't even know if it still worked. Occasionally, someone would press a key out of curiosity, only to hear a faint, uneven sound. After that, they would quickly lose interest and move on. To most people, the piano was just another old object. But to Sister Margaret, it was something else entirely. She would sometimes pass by that room on her way to the garden or chapel. Each time, her steps would slow down just a little. Her eyes would rest on the piano for a moment longer than necessary. Then, as if reminding herself of something, she would quietly walk away. Years passed like this. The days were calm and predictable. Morning prayers, simple meals, quiet work, evening reflection. There was comfort in that routine, and Sister Margaret seemed at peace within it. But deep inside, something had never completely faded. One evening, as the sun began to set and the convent grew quieter, a soft sound filled the hallway. It was so gentle at first that it almost blended with the silence. A few notes played slowly and carefully. Then more followed. The sound was coming from the small room with the old piano. Inside, Sister Margaret sat on the wooden bench, her hands resting lightly on the keys. For a moment, she hesitated, as if unsure whether she should continue. It had been so many years. Her fingers moved again, pressing another key. The sound was not perfect. The piano was old, slightly out of tune. But something about the way she played made it feel alive again. At first, her movements were slow, almost cautious. It was like someone trying to remember a language they hadn't spoken in years. But little by little, her hands began to find their way. The music grew steadier, then deeper. It was no longer just a few scattered notes. It became a melody, soft but full of feeling. The kind of music that doesn't need words because it speaks directly to the heart. As she played, something changed in her expression. The calm, quiet look she always carried was still there. But now there was something more. A kind of light, almost like a memory returning. She was no longer just Sister Margaret, the quiet nun in the garden. For those moments, she was the young woman she once had been. The one who sat at a piano for hours, lost in music. The one who felt every note as if it were part of her. Time seemed to slow down in that small room. The outside world faded away. There were no duties, no expectations, no rules. Just her and the music. When she finally stopped, her hands remained on the keys for a few seconds. The last note lingered in the air before slowly disappearing into silence. She took a deep breath. For a moment, she simply sat there, as if unsure what to do next. Then, gently, she closed the lid of the piano and stood up. Her face returned to its usual calm expression, but something inside her had shifted. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. As she walked out of the room, she paused at the doorway and looked back once more. The piano stood quietly again, just as it always had. But now it was no longer just an old object covered in dust. It had a voice again, and whether she realized it or not, so did she. That night, the convent remained as peaceful as ever. The sisters went about their routines, unaware of what had just happened. The halls were quiet, the lights dimmed, and everything seemed unchanged. But in truth, something had begun. Something that had been silent for years had finally found its way back. And it would not stay hidden forever. The next morning began like any other day at the convent. The bells rang softly before sunrise, calling everyone to prayer. The sisters moved quietly through the halls, their footsteps light and unhurried. The air carried the faint smell of fresh bread from the kitchen, and the sky outside was still pale with early light. Sister Margaret followed the same routine she had followed for years. She attended prayers, sat in silence during breakfast, and later made her way to the garden. To anyone watching, nothing about her seemed different. She moved with the same calm pace, spoke only when needed, and kept her gentle, thoughtful expression. But inside her, something felt new. The memory of the piano from the night before stayed with her. It wasn't loud or distracting, but it lingered quietly in her thoughts. As she watered the plants, her fingers sometimes paused, as if remembering the feeling of the keys beneath them. She tried to push the thought away. For so many years, she had trained herself not to look back. The life she had chosen required focus, discipline, and a kind of letting go. Music belonged to another time, another version of herself. And yet, something about that moment had felt right. Not wrong, not selfish, not distracting. Just natural. As the day went on, she kept herself busy. She trimmed dry leaves, checked the soil, and helped one of the younger sisters who was struggling to keep a small plant alive. She showed her how to gently loosen the soil and give it just enough water. Not too much, not too little. Everything needs balance, she said softly. The younger sister smiled and nodded, clearly grateful. By afternoon, the sun had warmed the garden, and the convent settled into its usual quiet rhythm. Some sisters were reading, others working, and a few resting. No one spoke about music. No one knew. But that evening, something unexpected happened. One of the younger sisters had forgotten her book in the common room. It was already late, and most of the lights had been dimmed. She walked quietly down the hallway, trying not to disturb anyone. As she reached the door of the small room, she noticed it was slightly open. At first, she thought nothing of it. Then she heard it. A soft melody. She froze. The sound was gentle but clear, flowing through the quiet hallway like a whisper that refused to be ignored. It wasn't the kind of playing someone does just to pass time. It had depth, feeling, and a kind of quiet strength. Carefully, she stepped closer. Through the small gap in the door, she saw Sister Margaret sitting at the old piano. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands moved across the keys with surprising confidence. The music filled the room, rising and falling like a calm wave. The young sister stood there, completely still. She had never seen anything like this before. Sister Margaret, who barely spoke and spent most of her time in the garden, was playing like someone who had done this her entire life. The notes were not just correct, they were alive. Without realizing it, the young sister leaned a little closer, afraid to miss even a second. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from something else. Something like wonder. After a few minutes, the music slowly came to an end. Sister Margaret's hands rested on the keys for a moment before she gently pulled them back. The young sister quickly stepped away from the door, worried she might have been seen. She didn't know why, but it felt like she had witnessed something very private. She quietly picked up her book and returned to her room, but her mind was full of questions. The next morning, she couldn't keep it to herself. During a small break, she sat with two other sisters and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I heard something last night," she said softly. They looked at her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. "There was music from the old piano." The others exchanged glances. "That piano barely works," another said. "Who would play it?" The young sister leaned in slightly. "It was Sister Margaret." There was a brief silence. They didn't laugh, but their expressions showed disbelief. "Sister Margaret?" one repeated. The young sister nodded. "I saw her. She was playing, and it was beautiful. Not just simple notes. It sounded like something from a concert." The two sisters looked at each other again, this time with more interest. "That doesn't sound possible," one of them said, though her voice was less certain now. "I'm telling the truth," the young sister replied. "You should hear it yourself." The conversation ended there, but the curiosity had already started to grow. That evening, the two sisters found themselves walking a little slower near the same hallway. They didn't say it out loud, but both were hoping to hear something. At first, there was nothing, just silence. They almost turned back. Then, just as they reached the end of the hall, the sound came again. Soft, steady, and unmistakable. They stopped. The music was real. Slowly, they moved closer to the door, just as the young sister had done the night before. This time, the door was slightly more open. Inside, Sister Margaret sat at the piano, completely focused. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried a quiet emotion. Her hands moved with ease, as if the years had not taken anything away from her skill. The two sisters stood there listening. One of them felt a sudden chill, not from cold, but from the feeling the music created. It was gentle, yet powerful enough to make her chest feel tight. The other sister felt her eyes begin to fill with tears, though she didn't fully understand why. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just listened. When the music ended, they stepped away quickly, just like the young sister had done. None of them wanted to interrupt or make Sister Margaret uncomfortable. Later that night, the three of them sat together again. This time, there was no disbelief, only quiet amazement. "I didn't expect that," one of them admitted. "She plays like someone who has trained for years," another said. The young sister nodded. "I told you." They sat in silence for a moment. Then one of them spoke softly. "Why would she never tell anyone?" It was a simple question, but no one had an answer. Over the next few days, the quiet discovery slowly spread. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but through whispers and careful conversations. One sister told another, then another. Soon, a small group began to gather in the hallway during the evenings, pretending to pass by, but really hoping to hear the music. Each time, Sister Margaret played without knowing she had an audience. And each time, the reaction was the same. Silence, then quiet emotion, then a feeling that stayed long after the last note faded. No one clapped. No one spoke. It felt too personal for that. But something was changing inside the convent. The old piano was no longer forgotten, and Sister Margaret was no longer just the quiet woman in the garden. Without saying a word, she had revealed a part of herself that no one had seen before. And now the sisters could not unsee it. They began to look at her differently, not with distance or formality, but with a new kind of respect, a quiet admiration. And deep inside, a question was beginning to form in all of them. If her music could make them feel this much in a small hallway, what would happen if the world heard it? That question stayed unspoken, for now. But it was only a matter of time before someone found the courage to ask it out loud. In the days that followed, the quiet discovery of Sister Margaret's music slowly turned into something more difficult to ignore. What had started as a secret shared between a few sisters was now known by many. Still, no one spoke about it openly in front of her. It remained something soft and unspoken, like a gentle understanding that passed from one person to another. Each evening, more sisters found reasons to walk near the small room with the old piano. Some carried books they didn't plan to read. Others pretended to be on their way somewhere else. But they all had the same hope, to hear even a few moments of that music again. And almost every night she played. Sister Margaret never looked toward the door. She never paused as if she sensed someone nearby. It was as though the music created a space where she was completely alone, even when she wasn't. The sisters would stand quietly, sometimes for several minutes, sometimes longer. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted to break that calm feeling. But as the days passed, the quiet admiration began to grow into something else. A feeling that this should not remain hidden. One afternoon, a small group of younger sisters gathered in the garden. Sister Margaret was not there. She had gone inside earlier, leaving behind the soft scent of the herbs she had been tending. The group sat close together, speaking in low voices. "We can't just keep pretending this isn't happening," one of them said. Another nodded. "It feels wrong to hide something so beautiful. But what can we do?" a third asked. "She clearly doesn't want attention." The first sister hesitated, then spoke again. "Maybe it's not about attention. Maybe it's about sharing something good." They all fell quiet for a moment, thinking. "There's a small gathering next week," someone said. "The one with the nearby community." The others looked up. What if she played there? The idea hung in the air. Felt bold. Maybe too bold. "She would never agree," one of them said quickly. "Not if we just ask like that," another replied. "But maybe if we explain it differently." They began to talk more seriously now, their voices still soft but filled with purpose. The idea slowly started to take shape. It wasn't about making her perform. It wasn't about showing her off. It was about giving her music a place where it could bring comfort to others. Later that evening, they found her in the garden, carefully tying a weak plant to a small wooden support. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then one stepped forward. "Sister Margaret," she said gently. Margaret looked up, her expression calm as always. "Yes, we wanted to ask you something." Margaret gave a small nod, inviting her to continue. "There's a gathering next week," the sister said. "A simple one. People from nearby will come. There will be some readings, maybe a little music." Margaret listened quietly. "We were wondering if you would consider playing." The words were spoken carefully, almost as if they might break something fragile. For a moment there was no response. Margaret lowered her gaze back to the plant, adjusting the string around it. Her hands moved slowly, thoughtfully. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she said at last. Her voice was gentle but firm. The sisters exchanged glances. "We understand," one of them said quickly. "But it wouldn't be about attention. It would just be sharing something meaningful." Margaret shook her head slightly. "My time for that has passed," she replied. "It doesn't feel that way," another said softly. Margaret paused. There was no anger in her expression. No discomfort. Just a quiet certainty. "I appreciate what you are saying," she said. "But some things belong to the past." The group fell silent. They didn't want to push too hard. They respected her too much for that. But at the same time, they couldn't ignore what they had felt when they heard her play. "It made us feel something," one of them said, almost without thinking. Margaret looked up again. The sister hesitated, then continued. "When you play, it's not just music. Feels like peace, like something that reaches inside and calms everything." Margaret didn't respond right away. The words seemed to settle in the space between them. After a few seconds, she gave a small, understanding smile. "I'm glad it brought you comfort," she said. Then she returned her attention to the plant. The conversation was over, or at least that's how it seemed. That night, the sisters gathered again, this time with a mix of disappointment and quiet determination. "She said no," one of them said. "I expected that," another replied. But did you see her face? The first one asked. She listened. She didn't dismiss it completely. They thought about that. She's not refusing because she doesn't care, someone said. She's refusing because she believes she shouldn't. That difference mattered. Over the next couple of days, the idea didn't disappear. If anything, it became stronger. More sisters began to talk about it. Not in a way that created pressure, but in a way that showed how deeply her music had affected them. Even some of the older sisters, who rarely got involved in such discussions, admitted they had listened from a distance. It reminded me of something I had forgotten, one of them said quietly. Another nodded. It felt honest. The feeling was shared by many, but not everyone agreed. One afternoon, word of these conversations reached someone in a position of authority within the convent. She was known for her strong sense of discipline and her belief in keeping life simple and focused. When she heard about the idea of Sister Margaret performing at a gathering, her reaction was immediate. This is not appropriate, she said firmly. A few sisters stood in front of her, listening carefully. It may seem harmless, she continued, but it brings attention, and attention can lead to pride. That is not why we are here. No one argued. They understood her concern, but at the same time it didn't feel completely right to them. It's not about pride, one of them said gently. It's about sharing something that helps people. The older woman shook her head. There are many ways to help people, she replied. We must choose the ones that keep us grounded. Her decision was clear. Sister Margaret would not perform. The message spread quickly. This time, there were no whispers of excitement, only quiet disappointment. That evening, the hallway near the piano felt different. The sisters still came. They still listened. But now there was a sense of something being held back. Something that could have grown, but was stopped before it had the chance. Inside the room, Sister Margaret played as she always did. Calm, focused, unaware of the full weight of the conversation happening around her. Or perhaps aware but choosing not to show it. Her music remained the same, but for those listening it felt different now. Not because the sound had changed, but because they knew something she did not. Or maybe something she did. And in that quiet space, a new feeling began to take shape. Not just admiration, not just curiosity, but a quiet question that refused to go away. Was it right to keep something so meaningful hidden? Or was it time for it to be heard, no matter the hesitation? No one had the answer yet, but the silence around that question was slowly becoming harder to ignore. The days after the decision felt heavier than usual, even though nothing had visibly changed. The bells still rang on time, meals were still quiet, and the routines stayed the same. But beneath that calm surface, there was a quiet tension that many of the sisters could feel. No one spoke openly about what had happened. The authority had made her decision clear, and it was not something to challenge. Still, the feeling of disappointment lingered, especially among the younger sisters who had hoped to see something meaningful shared with others. Sister Margaret, as always, continued her life without drawing attention. She spent her mornings in prayer, her afternoons in the garden, and her evenings in quiet reflection. If she noticed any change in the atmosphere around her, she did not show it. But the music did not stop. Each night, as the convent settled into silence, the soft sound of the piano returned. It was steady, calm, and deeply familiar now. The sisters still found their way to the hallway, though fewer gathered at once. They were more careful now, more aware of the boundaries that had been set. Even so, they listened, because they could not stop. One evening, as the music drifted through the halls, one of the older sisters stood a little farther back than the others. She had not been part of the earlier conversations. She had not encouraged the idea of a public performance. In fact, she had quietly agreed with the authorities' decision. But something about the music kept pulling her there. She stood with her hands folded, eyes closed, listening. After a while, she opened her eyes and looked toward the door. Her expression was thoughtful, almost conflicted. Later that night, she went to speak with the same authority who had refused the request. "I wanted to share something," she said gently. The authority looked at her, giving a small nod. I have been listening, the older sister continued, not out of curiosity, but because it is difficult not to. The authority remained silent, waiting. It brings a kind of stillness, she said, a kind that is not easy to find. The authority's expression did not change, but she listened carefully. I understand your concern, the older sister added. Truly. But I wonder if we are seeing this only from one side. The room fell quiet. After a moment, the authority spoke. Sometimes even good things must be limited, she said. Not everything that touches the heart is meant to be shared widely. The older sister nodded slowly. I agree, she said. But I also believe that some things are given for a reason. There was no argument, no raised voices, just two people sharing different thoughts, both with calm and respect. In the end, nothing changed. The decision remained. But the conversation left something behind, a small space of doubt or maybe just reflection. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening outside the convent. A local community group was preparing for a small charity event. It wasn't anything grand, just a simple gathering to bring people together, share stories, and raise a little support for those in need. They had reached out to the convent before, asking if any of the sisters would like to contribute in some way. Usually, the convent would send baked goods or offer quiet help behind the scenes. This time, the message arrived again. One of the sisters read it aloud during a small meeting. They are asking if we can contribute something personal this time, she said. Something that connects with people. There was a pause. The room was quiet, but the thought had already entered many minds. Music. No one said it at first, but it was there. The same group of younger sisters exchanged quick glances. They didn't need to speak to understand what each of them was thinking. Still, they hesitated. The earlier refusal was still fresh. After the meeting ended, a few of them stayed behind. This could be the chance, one whispered. Or it could make things worse, another replied. They stood there unsure. Finally, one of them said, What if we don't push it this time? The others looked at her. What do you mean? We don't ask her to perform, she explained. We just tell her about the event. Let her decide for herself. That idea felt different, gentler, more respectful. Later that day, they found Sister Margaret again in the garden. She was sitting this time, resting on the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. The light from the late afternoon sun fell softly around her. Sister Margaret, one of them said. She looked up, offering a small smile. Yes, there is something happening in the nearby community, the sister said. A small event. They've invited us to take part. Margaret listened quietly. We're not asking anything, she added quickly. We just thought you should know. Margaret nodded slowly. That is kind of you, she said. There was a brief silence. Then one of the sisters spoke again, more carefully this time. They mentioned music. Margaret's expression did not change, but her eyes lowered slightly. It's a simple gathering, the sister continued. Nothing formal, just people coming together. Margaret remained quiet. We thought, if you ever felt like playing again, outside this place, it might mean something to them. The words were soft, without pressure. No expectations, just an opening. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. The garden was still. Only the faint sound of leaves moving in the breeze filled the space. Finally, she spoke. I will think about it, she said. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. The sisters felt it immediately. It was the first time she had not refused. That evening, the music sounded slightly different. Not in skill, not in sound, but in feeling. There was something deeper in it now. Something thoughtful. Almost as if each note carried a quiet question. Those who listened could sense it, even if they couldn't explain it. Inside the room, Sister Margaret sat at the piano, her hands moving as they always had. But her mind was not as still as before. The idea had entered her thoughts, not as pressure, but as possibility. She remembered the words the sisters had spoken. Not about attention, not about performance, but about meaning. about bringing something to others. Her fingers slowed for a moment, then continued. For years, she had believed that part of her life was over. That music belonged to who she used to be, not who she had become. But now she wasn't as certain. The music filled the room, soft and steady. And for the first time in a long while, she did not play just to remember. She played as if she were deciding something. Not yet fully, not yet clearly, but slowly, quietly. A decision was beginning to form, and though no one knew it yet, that small shift would soon change everything. The day of the community gathering arrived more quietly than anyone expected. There were no big announcements inside the convent, no special preparations that stood out. Everything seemed normal on the surface, yet many of the sisters carried a quiet awareness of the day. They knew what had been discussed. They knew what had been refused. And they also knew that something had changed, even if no one had spoken about it openly again. That morning, Sister Margaret followed her usual routine. She attended prayers, helped in the kitchen for a short while, and later went to the garden. The air was cool, and the sky was clear. It was the kind of day that felt simple and calm. But her mind was not completely still. The invitation had stayed with her. Not as pressure, but as a quiet thought that returned again and again. She had told them she would think about it. And she had, more than she expected. As she moved slowly between the plants, she found herself remembering things she had not thought about in years. Not just the music, but the moments connected to it. Small gatherings, quiet rooms, people listening with closed eyes. She remembered how it felt to play not for herself, but for others. That feeling had been different, deeper. By the afternoon, some of the sisters had already left for the gathering. They carried simple items with them, food, small decorations, things to help the event feel warm and welcoming. A few remained behind. Sister Margaret was one of them, at least for a while. She sat alone in the small room with the piano, something she had not done during the daytime before. The sunlight entered softly through the window, falling across the old instrument. The room felt different in daylight, less hidden, more real. She walked toward the piano slowly and placed her hand on its surface. The wood felt slightly rough under her fingers. For a moment, she did nothing. Then she sat down. Her hands rested in her lap. Quiet, still. She closed her eyes. There was no music yet, just silence. But inside her, there was movement. A quiet question that had been growing stronger over the past few days. Was she holding on to something that was meant to be given? Or was she protecting something that should remain private? She opened her eyes and looked at the keys. Her fingers moved slightly, but she did not press them. Instead, she took a slow breath and stood up. The decision did not come as a sudden feeling. Came gently, like something settling into place. Outside, the afternoon light had started to soften. Without saying anything to anyone, Sister Margaret left the room, walked through the hallway, and made her way toward the exit of the convent. One of the sisters who was still there noticed her. "You're going?" she asked, surprised. Margaret gave a small nod. "Yes," she said simply. The sister's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't ask any more questions. She just smiled, softly but with clear understanding. "Take your time," she said. Margaret returned the smile and continued walking. The path to the community gathering was not far. It was a small place, set up in an open area with simple decorations. People were already there, sitting on chairs, talking quietly, and waiting for the program to begin. There was nothing grand about it. No large stage, no bright lights, just a simple setup and a sense of togetherness. Some of the sisters who had arrived earlier were helping organize things. When they saw Sister Margaret approaching, they froze for a moment. They had not expected her to come. One of them quickly walked toward her. "You came," she said, her voice filled with surprise. Margaret nodded gently. "I thought I would sit and listen," she replied. The sister smiled, though her eyes showed something more, hope. Margaret found a seat among the others. The event began. There were a few short talks, some readings, and a small group singing simple songs. It was peaceful and sincere, just as it had been described. Margaret listened quietly. Her hands rested in her lap, still and calm. But inside something was building. After some time, one of the organizers stepped forward. "We have time for one more contribution," he said. "If anyone would like to share something, music, a story, anything meaningful, you are welcome." There was a brief silence. People looked around, but no one moved. The moment began to pass. Then slowly Sister Margaret stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. No sudden attention. But those who knew her noticed immediately. The sisters exchanged quick glances, their hearts beginning to beat faster. Margaret walked toward the front with quiet steps. There was a simple piano placed to the side. It was not perfect, but it was in better condition than the one in the convent. She reached it and paused for a moment. The room grew quieter. People watched, unsure of what to expect. An elderly nun sitting at a piano was not something that usually drew attention. But there was something in her presence that made people curious. She sat down. Her hands hovered above the keys. For a second, nothing happened. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, simple, but clear. The room fell completely silent. As her fingers continued to move, the music began to grow. Not louder, but deeper. Each note carried a feeling that was hard to explain but easy to feel. People who had been shifting in their seats became still. Conversations stopped. Even the smallest sounds seemed to fade away. The music filled the space, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that gently held it. It was calm yet powerful, simple yet full of meaning. Those who listened began to feel something change inside them. Some lowered their heads. Some closed their eyes. Some simply stared, unable to look away. The sisters who stood nearby felt it strongly. They had heard her play before. But this was different. This was not hidden. This was not behind a half-closed door. This was open. And somehow it felt even more powerful. Margaret did not look at the audience. She did not react to their silence. She simply played. Every movement of her hands was steady and sure, as if she had never stopped. As if all those years had only been a pause. The music continued, flowing naturally, without force. And in that moment, no one was thinking about rules or decisions, or whether this should or should not be happening. They were simply listening and feeling. When the final notes came, they did not end suddenly. They faded slowly, gently, like a quiet goodbye. Margaret's hands rested on the keys for a moment before she lifted them. The silence that followed was deep. No one moved. No one spoke. It lasted longer than expected. And then, slowly, people began to stand. Not all at once, but one by one. There was no loud cheering. No noise. Just a quiet, heartfelt response that spread through the entire space. A kind of respect that did not need words. Margaret stood up. She looked at the piano for a brief moment, then turned and walked back. Her face was calm, just as it always had been. But something inside her had changed. Not in a way that took away her peace, but in a way that expanded it. She returned to her seat quietly. The sisters looked at her, some with tears in their eyes. But no one spoke, because nothing needed to be said. What had just happened was enough. And in that simple moment, something that had been hidden for years had finally found its place in the world. The night felt longer than usual, even though nothing around had really changed. The same narrow street stretched outside, the same dim lights flickered in the distance, and the same quiet air wrapped everything in a strange calm. But something inside had shifted. It was the kind of feeling you cannot explain easily, like when you sense that things are about to change, even if you do not yet know how. Sitting near the window, there was a moment of stillness. Not the heavy kind, but the kind that lets thoughts rise slowly, one by one. Everything that had happened before now felt connected in a way that was not clear earlier. Small choices, random meetings, unexpected turns, they all seemed like pieces of something bigger. It is funny how life works like that. At the time, nothing makes sense. You walk through your days thinking you are just passing time. But later, when you look back, you realize you were actually building something step by step, even without knowing it. The room was quiet, but not empty. There was a presence in the silence, like it was holding onto every memory that had been made there. Every laugh, every worry, every late-night thought. All of it stayed in the walls, even if no one could see it. A deep breath broke the stillness. It felt like the first real breath in a long time. Not rushed, not forced. Just calm and steady. Sometimes that is all it takes. One moment of slowing down to see things clearly again. The journey so far had not been easy. There were times when giving up felt like the simplest choice. Times when nothing seemed to move forward, no matter how hard the effort was. But even those moments had their place. They taught patience. They taught strength. And most importantly, they taught how to keep going when nothing feels certain. Outside, a soft breeze passed by, carrying the faint sound of distant life. Somewhere, people were still awake, still moving, still chasing their own paths. It was a reminder that no one is truly alone in their struggles. Everyone is fighting something, even if it is not visible. There was a time when everything felt overwhelming, when even small decisions felt heavy. But now, looking at everything from a distance, it seemed different. Not easier, but clearer. Like the fog had slowly started to lift. Change does not happen all at once. It comes quietly, in small steps, in tiny realizations. And before you know it, you are no longer the same person you used to be. The thoughts kept flowing, but they were not chaotic anymore. They had direction. There was a sense of understanding that had not been there before. Not perfect understanding, but enough to move forward. It is strange how fear works. Most of the time, it is not about what is actually happening. It is about what might happen. It grows in uncertainty. But once you face things even a little, that fear starts to shrink. The past had its share of mistakes. Moments that could have gone better. Words that could have been said differently. But holding on to those things did not change them. All it did was make the present heavier. Letting go is not easy. Sounds simple, but it takes time. Takes effort. And sometimes, it takes repeating the same lesson again and again until it finally settles in your heart. The clock ticked slowly, marking time in a steady rhythm. Each second felt meaningful in its own quiet way. Not rushed, not wasted, just passing like it always does. There was a realization that growth is not loud. It does not come with big announcements or sudden changes. It happens in silence. In the way you think differently. In the way you react calmly instead of rushing. In the way you choose peace over unnecessary stress. Looking ahead did not feel as scary anymore. It still had its unknowns, but they did not feel like threats. They felt like possibilities. The mind wandered back to the beginning of this journey. Everything felt so uncertain then. There were doubts everywhere. Questions with no answers. But somehow, step by step, things started to take shape. Not everything went according to plan. In fact, most things did not. But maybe that was the point. Maybe things were never meant to follow a straight path. Sometimes, the detours teach more than the destination ever could. There was a quiet strength building inside. Not the kind that needs to be shown or proved. The kind that simply exists. The kind that lets you stand steady, even when things around you are not. The world outside continued moving, unaware of the thoughts unfolding in this small space. But that did not matter. This moment was enough. A small smile appeared, not because everything was perfect, but because there was acceptance. Acceptance of what was, what is, and what could be. It is easy to chase big dreams and forget the small steps. But those small steps are what carry you forward. They are what shape your path, even when you do not notice it. There was a time when everything felt like a race. Like you had to reach somewhere quickly. But now it felt different. There was no rush. No pressure to prove anything. Just a simple understanding that every step matters. The light from outside slowly faded as the night grew deeper. Shadows stretched across the room, but they did not feel heavy. They felt calm, like part of the natural rhythm. Thoughts of the future came again, but this time they were not filled with worry. They were filled with curiosity. What comes next? It is a question that never has a clear answer. But maybe that is what makes it interesting. If everything was known, there would be no excitement, no surprises, no growth. The journey ahead would have its challenges. That much was certain. But there was also something else. A quiet confidence that things would be handled one step at a time. The past had shaped this moment, but it did not control it. The future would be shaped by what comes next, not by what has already happened. That thought alone felt freeing. Another deep breath. This time it felt lighter. There was no need to have everything figured out. No need to have all the answers. Sometimes just moving forward is enough. The night continued, but it did not feel endless anymore. Felt like a pause. A moment between what was and what will be. And in that pause there was peace. Not loud, not dramatic. Just simple and real. The kind of peace that does not come from outside, but from within. The kind that stays even when everything else changes. Time passed quietly, but it did not feel wasted. Every second felt like it was adding something even if it was not visible. Growth is like that. It happens beneath the surface. Slowly, steadily. And one day you look back and realize how far you have come. The journey was not over. Not even close. But it no longer felt heavy. Felt meaningful. And that made all the difference. There was a final glance outside, where the night still held its calm presence. Somewhere in the distance, a faint light remained, steady and quiet. Felt like a reminder. No matter how dark things may seem, there is always some light, even if it is small. And sometimes that is enough to keep going. The moment settled into stillness again, but this time it felt complete. Not because everything was finished, but because everything was understood, at least for now. And with that understanding came a quiet readiness. For whatever comes next.